We want to get started here. Today we're going to be going over Department of Wildlife and Parks budget, and then whatever recommendation you might want to make at the end. We'll have our reports. And by the way, what we're doing here is we have one more to do with Kansas Department of Health and Environment is left for this committee, for a budget committee. So we're planning on doing that probably Friday, the way it looks, the schedule looks. And we have to have a deliberation time unless we're agreed on what the governor's recommendation is. Then we don't need to deliberate much or add other enhancements. So but if there are other enhancements that want to be added, we have to vote them in on this committee. So that'll take care of it then. And then we'll turn that in and report into the Ways and Means on what the governor's recommendation was and whatever changes we made. So just keep that in mind. That's how it's supposed to work. But anyway, glad everybody braved the weather. Nice little snow out there once again. At least we're home last couple of days. We had 30-mile-an-hour wind with it, and so the snow went down Texas. I think they got some of it down there, but we certainly appreciate you coming out in this these temperatures, and I think after a while we might just get used to it. The way this winter is going. As a former dairyman, it was bad cold all the time, so we just got used to it. Okay, with that, we will begin with Department of Wildlife and Parks. And Victoria, you want to start with this budget overview, and then we'll get the secretary in here. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You should have the white document, Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism in front of you. The first thing I just want to point out about Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism is that it is primarily fee-funded. They very rarely receive state general funds, so it's almost entirely fee-funded. There was a small exception last year. They did receive $2 million to assist with state park repairs, thanks to the 2019 flooding. So other than the $2 million last year, they normally don't receive a state general fund. So I just want to start by pointing that out. The budget starts on page 645. On page 645, I'm looking underneath the box. That third paragraph down starts, the agency estimates revised 2021 operating expenditures of $75.6 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $1.1 million above the 2021 approved amount. And that increase of $1.1 million is spread across a couple of categories. So that first bullet, contractual services, on the bottom of page 645. There was an increase in expenditures for advertising, especially in the tourism program. The next category continues on to page 646. On page 646, that commodities bullet notes that there is an increased expenditure of federal funds in the fish program for habitat supplies, including tanks, fish feeders, and feed bins. And looking right above the box, the governor recommends 2021 operating expenditures of $76 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $331,000 above the agency's request. And that's because the governor included $331,000 of CARES money. So that's federal CARES money, which is being used for telecommunication equipment and cleaning supplies, or PPE. And Mr. Chairman, I'll just continue on to fiscal year 2022 and do questions at the end. Still on page 646 at the bottom under the box. The agency requests 2022 operating expenditures of $84.2 million, all from special revenue funds. This is an increase of $8.6 million above the agency's 2021 revised estimate. But I want to point out, of that $8.6 million increase, $6 million of that is an increase in federal funds. So the agency is expecting increased federal funds for fiscal year 2022. So the majority of that increase is federal funds. And we'll keep looking at that increase on page 647. On page 647, the majority of the increase between 21 and 22 can be found under contractual services. That contractual services bullet says there's increased expenditures on building and ground maintenance in the public lands program. And it continues on to describe that federal spending that I mentioned, increased federal funds in the wildlife and ecological services programs, which is used for wildlife research studies as well as habitat restoration work. And looking right above the box on page 647, the governor recommends 2022 operating expenditures of $79.5 million, all from special revenue funds. This is a decrease of $4.7 million below the agency's 2022 request. And this is caused by the governor recommending the Division of Tourism be transferred from Wildlife Parks and Tourism to the Department of Commerce beginning in fiscal year 2022. So moving the entire division to the Department of Commerce. And still on page 647, the agency did request one enhancement for fiscal year 2022. And that's an enhancement of $50,000, all from the State Water Plan Fund for the agency's Aquatic Nuisance Species Program. These funds would be used to purchase equipment to inspect and decontaminate boats, as well as hire technicians to perform those duties. But the governor did not recommend that enhancement request, so it is not included in the starting place of this budget. And finally, Mr. Chairman, before I stand for questions, I'll look briefly at the agency's capital improvements request, which are on page 665. On page 665, you can find a breakout of the agency's capital improvement expenditures. Underneath the box, the agency's asking revised capital improvement expenditures of $15.9 million, including $951,000 state general fund. That increase is entirely due to rollover funds. Again, I mentioned the $2 million the agency received for state park repairs. They received it last year. $951,000 of that is rolling over to this year to be spent still on state park repairs, but they just didn't spend it last year, so it's rolling over. And the governor did concur with the agency's capital improvements requests for 21 and for 22. And Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions on Wildlife Parks and Tourism's budget.
Okay. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Very much for that report. Committee, any questions for the advisor? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While we went over some of the other budgets, not wildlife and parks, but we saw a category in there where the governor recommended reduce the FTE for shrinkage, and I did not see that in your report. Do we know how many authorized positions we have and how many actual positions we have?
Sure. So in answer to the first part of your question, the governor did not recommend any sort of shrinkage adjustment for Wildlife Parks and Tourism like she did in other ones. I don't speak for the governor, but I would feel somewhat comfortable saying that it's because they don't receive any state general fund. So most of the other agencies where she did that receive state general fund, but this one does not. And then for the authorized employees, if you look on the very front page of your budget analysis, you can see FTE positions, and you can see how many positions they have.
The other question was how many are those that are, these are authorized, how many are actual?
I would have to check with the agency for how many are vacant, but I'll find that out for you.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, any other questions? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that tourism will be transferred from this agency to Commerce. But when I look at the budget, I don't see a corresponding reduction in the expenditures except on page 645 or 654, the tourism, but I'm looking at the overall on the front, and then also on page. So is there a reduction to account for the transferring of tourism?
There is about $4.7 million. So if you want to look on the front page, just for instance, there's the agency request at the very top. The agency request for fiscal year 2022 is about $94 million. And then on the right next to that, the governor's recommendation is about $90 million. So there is a reduction shown on that front page, or it's mentioned on page 647.
Well, what I'm looking at was actual 2020 on the very front page is $93 million. And then the governor rec in 21 was 91.8, and we're at 90. So I don't see that 4 million reduction from 21 to 22.
Right, so there was, from 21 to 22, the agency is increasing expenditures in other areas, but then there's a decrease in tourism. So from 21 to 22, there's not a direct correlation between, there's not a direct reflection of the $4 million because they're spending in more in other areas, if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't, but on page 643, when I look at the agency's budget from 13, it was 63 million. Now we're at, in round numbers, 80 million. And I realized that around 13 is when tourism came in. And you may not have an answer. That might be more for the agency to inform us or to enlighten us as to why their budget has gone up so significantly. But I do have a question for you, and I ask those questions of you so the agency can hear them and answer them later. On page 649, when you look at the Wildlife Fee Fund, the ending balance in 20 was 14.7 million, and the ending balance, according to the Governor Rec, is 6.4 million, well less than half. Is this in danger of continuing to fall off the table and zeroing out, or do you have a historical perspective?
I mean, I'll let the agency answer whether they're afraid they're going to run out of money in that fund. And on page 649, there are increased expenditures, which affects the ending balance in increased expenditures in 22 as compared to 20. And then also, well, there is increased revenue, but mostly increased expenditures. So I'll let the agency answer if they're afraid of running out of money.
My point is, I can see if things continue this way, that the wildlife fee, there will be a request for allowing for a fee increase, Mr. Chairman. But that's all I have at this time. Thank you, sir.
Senator Fagg, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wanting to visit a little bit about the $50,000 that the agency had requested to combat aquatic nuisance, which is zebra mussels probably.
Correct.
And as I read through this, it talks about some matching funds from federal funds, which catches my eye, and seasonal techs, so we're not hiring full-time people. So I guess my question is that being cost-effective, you know, that's a problem with some of these lakes that I know, and I don't know if the 50,000 is going to help us or not. It'd be interesting to hear from them about that part of it. So this 50,000 would be coming out of fees too. There isn't any general fund money out of that.
Right. It's, they requested it from the State Water Plan Fund, which is funded by a couple of things. It does have some fees, but there's also transfer from the State General Fund and from the Economic Development Initiatives Fund. So it's yeah.
Okay, all right. Are they here where they can say something about that? I'd be interested.
They're going to present next, if that's okay. So then when they get up here.
Right after the
Okay,
budget here.
all right.
All right, any other questions for Victoria? For now, thank you very much for the information. Next, we'll have Secretary Lovis from Wildlife and Parks. Welcome to the committee, sir, and we're anxious to hear your report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. And I appreciate the questions and the dialogue so far. I'd be glad to address those as we work through here, and I think some of them might be addressed in my initial comments too. It is good to see you all again. Thanks for the opportunity to review our budget status. As you're aware, our mission is to provide and enhance outdoor recreation and tourism opportunities while at the same time protecting, conserving, and promoting wise use of the state's natural resources, thus contributing to and benefiting the state's economy and public health, cultural heritage, and the quality of life. So if we do our job well, then we benefit the state and Kansans in all those ways. Included in this package is the overview that Victoria went through, talking about our division goals. So there's a lot of details in there if you're interested in what our different divisions do, how we kind of divide up our work. It has been a challenging year as we navigated the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has been a good year, as I think you are probably aware, in terms of visitation. We've had a new record with over 8.6 million visitors at our state parks. So that's been really good. This has allowed us to take in some extra revenue that we've put into the hole kind of that we dug in 2019. As Victoria mentioned about the flooding, 2019 floods were high on order of the way they were in 1993, but importantly, they lasted so long that they really created a lot of damage, especially in our roadways. Every flood, every time we get high floods, it affects our docks. We move everything we can to create as little impact as possible, and I frankly was impressed at our parks managers at how expert they were in shutting off power, pumping the restrooms, moving what they could, but docks and things like that simply couldn't be moved in that time frame. And so we lost docks, we lost some buildings that were low-lying. Importantly, though, our paved areas that were underwater for all those months really didn't survive well. They basically lost their integrity, and we're having to replace a lot of those roads. So that's been a big expense. Overall, at the end of 2019, we estimated that our damages to parks alone, there were other damages to public lands associated with those reservoirs. Parks alone was just shy of $10 million. We definitely appreciated the $2 million that Victoria mentioned that we got from the Governor's State General Fund. So that got us started. But the money, any extra money we made last year in parks is going into those continued repairs. It'll take us a few years to do those. There's just a lot of work to be done, and I could take you right down the road to Perry and show you some campgrounds we still haven't gotten rewired. We just haven't had the money yet to rewire, rework those roads, and reopen those. Nevertheless, with the areas we did have open, we had record visitation in 2020, and we are optimistic we'll have really good visitation in 2020 also. As Victoria mentioned, we spend about half of that $2 million, and we're receiving bids right now for Hillsdale Reservoir up toward Kansas City, where we expect to spend the rest of that $950,000. In our submission, and this might get to Senator Peck's question about changes in budget levels, in our submission, we have done our best to accurately show the federal funds that come into the agency. As you're aware, we take the fees that we collect from sportsmen and sportswomen in Kansas and then leverage those federal funds. And those funds are there because when you buy fishing hooks or hunting ammunition or a boat, there are some taxes that the Fed keeps, and then we leverage those with the money that we raise locally. So the money that we raise is really critical because of the high match rate that we get federally. So really critical for us to remain healthy. It looks like there's a $10.4 million increase in the budget for fiscal year 2022. But really, these funds are funds we've received all along. We've received every year, and we've used those in past years. But what we recognized when we were evaluating the budget last year was we hadn't been putting those in our budget accounts. It was just a practice that we had. Nobody was trying to hide anything. It was just understood that those funds were in a different category. So in an attempt to be as transparent as possible, all we've done this year with the budget is put them in there where everybody can see them. So it's really no change to the amount of money that we're getting or we're spending. It's just a change in transparency, and that's been our goal, to be more transparent and open. Those funds are mainly divided up, and we can go through the year-by-year comparisons if you want to, but they're mainly used in public lands, wildlife, fisheries, ecological services, and education. One other thing I might note, and there was a mention in your comments earlier about fee caps. For a few years, we've been hoping to have a bill in front of you, and it won't come before you this year, but we will propose it for next session, where we can raise the cap on what we can charge for fees. We are close to those caps now. We typically raise that fee cap every 10 to 15 years, roughly. And then in the interim time, we'll do incremental increases for the fees that we charge for fishing and hunting and boating and those kind of things. What we understand is everybody's concerned about fees getting raised too high. But what we find is that the people that use our facilities, while there are some exceptions, broadly, they are in favor of those incremental changes over time because they know it goes right into the facilities across the state that they use and enjoy. And what we'd like to do when we come to you next session, what we'll come to you is with a proposal we'll tie those fees to cost of living increases. And when we look back and analyzed our fee increases for the last 70 years, what we saw was they almost match exactly, it wasn't intentional on our part, but they almost exactly matched cost of living increases. And so they're very logical and they're very measured, and that's really all we propose to do in the future with resident fees. With non-resident fees, what we'd propose to you then is that we have a little more flexibility because, as most of you are aware, I'm sure, the demand by non-residents to come in Kansas and enjoy these resources is very high. And so they're willing to pay a premium and are happy to do that and come here and enjoy our fishing and hunting opportunities. So we'll talk with you about that next session. Not today, but I'm glad to answer any questions if you have any about that or anything else, Mr. Chair. So,
Okay, thank you very much. I have just a general question. I thought I heard on the news a while back, how many visitors on state this year? 8 million?
8.6 was a new record. So
I thought what was new was over 8 million, but
right.
It's quite that's the record too, isn't it?
It is a record. I would love it if all that extra visitation was profit. As you can imagine, particularly in the early part of last year, we spent a lot of extra resources cleaning and changing our practices to make sure our visitors were safe from COVID, particularly on shared facilities, shower buildings, restrooms, things like that. We had extra cleaning details, and in our cabins the same way, because we simply just didn't want anybody to get COVID by visiting our parks. So our costs did go up. We had a lot more overtime because of the high visitation rates, but still we did get extra revenue because of all the extra visitors.
Any questions? Secretary? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This 50,000 because we just read this here. Can that 50,000 be absorbed in with a $76 million budget somewhere? If it's important. I like the federal matching, if it's going to be effective in what we're doing. What's your thoughts on it? How important is that 50,000?
Well, it's really important. As you're aware, you mentioned zebra mussels. Those are one of the invasive species we worry about. We have invasive plants, particularly Eurasian water milfoil. We've got zebra mussels, then another even more dangerous mussel called a quagga mussel that's in Colorado and some surrounding states, but it's not in Kansas yet. And I can get into the details of that if you want, but then some other fish species too that are moving in, the Asian carp especially. So that money is really important because it leverages at 3 to 1, that federal money. And then those stations that you mentioned are mobile, basically boat and trailer check stations, so that we can determine based on where the main traffic is, where our highest risk of people coming into our state and bringing those nuisance species. And then we can check their boats as they're moving onto the water, wash them off, rinse out the live wells, just basic things. It only takes a few minutes, but that's what it takes to keep those critters out. And you mentioned seasonals, the one other thing you mentioned. That is not something we do year-round. We do it when the volume and boat movement is highest. In midwinter, nothing survives driving down the highway, these kind of conditions, but in the summer when it's warm, they will. So that's why we focus there. And we can get seasonal college students and do that real effectively.
So the 50,000, can you absorb that in your budget somewhere, if it's that important? That's my question.
So you'd rather it not come from the state water plan? Is that?
Well, you're talking $76 million, and right now we don't have anything coming from general fund, and it's from fees. I'm just questioning because I think that's probably important, the 50,000, to make sure we get it from somewhere.
It is, and So we simply have relied as part of the overall water plan for the state of Kansas, keeping our water bodies clear of those invasives and reducing the spread is important to waters everywhere across the United States. So that's why we thought that was appropriate. Could we find it somewhere else? I'm sure we could do that.
3-to-1 match catches
Right. That's what's so valuable about it.
Yeah, one more question, Mr. Chairman. On your fees, when you spend $10 million around the lakes, putting in the new asphalt that was tore up, do you try to keep your expenses, your fees tied to your expenses? Because the people that visit the lakes are the ones that's going to use those deals versus the guy that's out hunting.
Right.
So I would think as you talk about raising fees, you hate to have the hunter paying for the guy that's.
Right. In fact, we aren't,
understand what I'm
in
saying?
fact, we aren't allowed to do that. We're limited, when we raise fees from, that go into our wildlife fee fund from hunting and fishing, those have to be held separate. And because they're leveraging that federal money, well, there has to be a barrier between that and what we're doing in our parks. So the parks' fees and their expenditures stay with the parks, and we can't mix those two. So we do exactly what you're suggesting.
And I did have somebody in my area, a constituent, that owns some places that he rents out, that was saying that our out-of-state hunting license, that he had lost some people this year because of it being too high.
Too high?
Yeah, so I thought I would pass that on to you.
Appreciate that.
That he was concerned about if I ever had a chance to say something to you, and here it is, so.
Yeah, good. Well, I appreciate the input. Was it deer or was it upland game? Do you remember?
It was down around Elk City, Elk Falls,
Okay.
down that area.
Okay. One of the things that we're faced with is, of course, for the last 2 years, we've had the maximum number of non-residents get deer permits. We manage that herd so it's consistently high quality. That's what gives Kansas its great reputation for being a trophy deer state. So we've actually sold every permit that we're able to, based on our current configuration, to non-resident deer hunters. Waterfowl, I was down in southeast Kansas around Elk City a few weeks ago at the end of the waterfowl season asking how it was going. And we got a lot of comments about the amazing number of non-resident waterfowl hunters. In fact, their records showed that in this season, they were keep updating them every week. This season, more than half of the waterfowl hunters at Neosho, which is down by Parsons, a great waterfowl area, more than half the hunters were non-residents. So we have a high non-resident demand, and we're getting feedback from both deer and upland and waterfowl hunters saying, gosh, is there a way that we can tone this down? So it's a balancing act, right? We appreciate them coming in and spending their money. At the same time, we have to maintain a place where resident Kansans feel like they can have a good opportunity to go out and enjoy the resources we have here too. So we're trying to balance that. Thank you.
Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. One question I asked Victoria was the number of FTE positions. Looks like the governor recommended 452, that we know the 12. But your actual positions versus your approved positions, what's the difference? What's the numbers?
So I'm not sharp on those. We'll have to get those to you. Generally, we have been trying to not increase. Obviously, we're having to pay our own way. It's like any of a business that you all have. So we're trying to be careful. As we lose people, we're trying to be judicious about replacing those. We recognize that in certain areas, and I'd point out particularly information services, our communications group, as well as our recruitment, retention, hunter education folks, we feel like those are some areas that we need to expand a little bit. So it only makes sense that we look in other areas of our agency where we maybe can back off a little bit. Maybe some positions don't need to be filled when they come open. So that's what we're trying to do over time. But we'll be glad to get you those reconciled numbers.
The only thing I was trying to do was help get the senator down here from El Dorado and get him some $50,000.
Okay, generate those. We're working too. I got lots of ideas on how we can do that. We're working on them.
All right, thank you very much. I did might add on, I'm surprised that what guide hunters are getting to bring out-of-state people to hunt, thousands of dollars that people pay, I was kind of surprised they was complaining about what the price of the tag was, so, but.
I appreciate the comment. That's unusual from what I'm used to hearing. Typically, they feel like they come here, they camp out for weeks out at Cedar Bluff. I was out there around Christmas talking with some people, and there was a Texas outfitter there driving up and down the roads looking to hunt geese. And they had a lot of clients who were coming and seemed to be doing a very good business there. So we aren't hearing that complaint, but obviously some people are concerned about the rates. One person, okay, thank you.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lovelace, for being here. I, too, am interested in the enhancement of the $50,000 to combat aquatic nuisance species. I'm assuming that the federal government wouldn't want to match their own dollars. So these would have to be either come from fees or come from the state general fund to get that match.
Right, and I should, Chad might know, he doesn't know, he already told me. We'll check. It is a fairly small amount, it's an important program, and one thing that I'm wondering, we'll ask our folks and get back to you, is if we're able to, there are some barriers, as I mentioned before, about how you can use fishing and hunting fees that you raise, and my bet is, because it's so important, I will bet that we aren't able to use those for that type of program, aquatic nuisance species program, even though it obviously benefits the health of our waters and our fisheries. I bet you we can't use them, and that's been the barrier in the past, because we know it's important. We work with the Water Office, Kara and her folks, every year to try to work that in, and they obviously see the value of this along with us. I'm pretty sure that's the barrier. We can't use those fishing and hunting license fees to leverage that federal money. I think you're right, Senator.
Well, thank you. And it would be good to understand that before we make our recommendations, because we can't ask you to find it if there are limits on the other funds that you have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I was going to mention, what's the update on the algae bloom?
Yeah.
Progress on that, is that any?
So there has been some progress, and we're a partner in that. We work closely with KDHE and the Water Office. We're learning a lot. There's a lot of research being done. In fact, cutting-edge research being done in Kansas that's applying to blue-green algae blooms all around the world, and learning a lot about the role that nutrients play in flows. And the latest that we're working with our partners on is trying to help the Corps of Engineers understand the value of moving water through the reservoir at certain times a year and allowing water and nutrients to be moving out with it, and blue-green algae. So we understand the value of that. We did an experiment in a couple of coves at Milford last summer to see about a treatment method to see if that had promise. So we're continuing to try to learn, but we, at this point, are largely at the mercy of springtime flows and the conditions that allows. If we have good flows and decent water levels, then it gives us a lot of flexibility as far as moving water out, and that seems to be a huge benefit in trying to reduce those summertime algae blooms.
Okay. Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, just a comment. Being on the Travel and Tourism Council, I was taking note of the contractual services. Now, granted, it was tourism, and that's not you anymore. But if any of you have not seen the new program, the advertising program that Bajillion has put together, we are finally marketing our state in a really dynamic, energetic way. It was there before, but it was a little sleepy. And this is not sleepy, and I see really good things. I think that's a great investment. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had mentioned that we had a good year in wildlife parks tourism, which I'm glad to hear. I enjoy the outdoors. As a matter of fact, I think our committee meetings should all be outdoors. I just enjoy it outside.
With you.
Okay. So we ready to go outside, Mr. Chairman?
You're driving us over.
But I bring that up because during COVID, I'm certain a lot of people decided to take their outings in places like parks because they could be spaced out. I don't see that as an ongoing thing. Now, people have discovered our parks, but my question to you is, does the agency have a plan for a maybe significant reduction in attendance at our parks and various other places, something going forward? Because of the fact, I think it was just a bump up.
We know that competing activities, sports and, church and a lot of other things will come back that people weren't able to do last year. What we're trying to do is, we think it'll continue into 2021, and we're trying to communicate with those people that maybe came for the first time to remind them what a good experience that was and try to encourage them to come back. But we understand it may dip down some once we get out of the COVID business, but we're going to try to sustain that as best we can. And as always, trying to recruit new people. Interesting data was increase across the country in outdoor recreation use was like 80% during COVID, so really high, but the best news of that is about 30% of that was new users, people that had never used these facilities before. So we're excited about that. We want to capitalize on that and keep them coming back.
I guess one reason I bring this up, I would just caution against maybe getting too excited about bringing in additional personnel and spending a lot of money that we may not be able to afford. I do have one question as it relates to the budget, and I had asked our fiscal analyst this. As far as the wildlife fee fund analysis, we only have here from 2020 forward. 2020, the ending balance was 14.7 million, and it looks like in 22 we're at 6.5 million.
Yeah.
And is that a trend that, or do you?
Yeah, it's not a trend. We typically, at the end of each year, we shoot to be between 15 and 20 million dollars left in our budget, and we have pretty consistently been doing that now. I'm not saying those numbers are wrong, but we can work with Victoria to give you our best numbers. Year in and year out, we're right between that 15 and 20 million dollar amount.
So we're not seeing the fee fund go down, the balance go down and down and down and down to where you're going to have to make some or ask for some fee increases?
Not at all. We're running it just like you do your family budget, where we're trying to retain some in there for buffer in case, the federal funds that we depend on so much, those can decline, based on who's in office and how many guns people are buying, things like that. And so we appreciate the good times, but we recognize that those are fleeting. And so we try to be responsible in how we budget.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do think there are a lot of guns being purchased right now because of who's in office. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Anyone else? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm very pleased to have one of the park permits on my car. And can you tell us anything about how that program is working? And I'm surprised that I guess you're not, they talk about performance measures, but you're not really seeing an increase for the next year in sales of those, or?
Well, we initially, when people come out for the first time, dedicated users like you and me, we buy those permits when we renew our license. We have those on there automatically, and it's a bargain when we do it that way. A lot of the increase that we saw were in people who were saying, hey, maybe I'll go to the park this weekend. So it was more like a day pass that they would get. But hopefully, we're, of course, marketing to them to say, 2021, get your year-long pass for $15 per vehicle. And so hopefully they see the value in that and they're expanding it. But last year, a lot of it was kind of first-time users, just dipping their toe in the water. In fact, one comment I might make to you, we had great comments as I was visiting our folks around the state. Our folks on public lands and parks both said they've never taught so many people how to paddle a kayak or to tie on a fishing hook or to put up a tent as they did last year. So it was a really good year in that regard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We appreciate the report, and we probably might be looking for you next week when a few wildlife and park bills come up there yet. So
thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee, looks like what we've got is that we conclude the Department of Wildlife and Parks, and the governor's recommendations are in there. We don't have a problem with those, and unless somebody does. But the only thing we have to really resolve is we're going to do the $50,000 for nuisance species, so we can make that an ask from this committee to support that. So somebody wants to voice the committee's opinion? We want to make a motion that we use the $50,000. Senator Pack. Yeah. Kara, you want to come up and?
I just want to save her a little bit. I don't know that that's her position to be able to say that. And so I think it's up to us, and then eventually, because we'll make, I'm certainly interested in the water office and making some adjustments, but eventually we have to balance this sheet, okay? And so that can get reconciled in the larger budget when we have to move money around. So I would, if that is your intentions, I would certainly put it in.
So I'd make a motion that we do the $50,000. Do you make a note to that? I think it's what's been happening
Yes, we will, in the report, we've,
within the report.
Yes, that's
So let's make a $50,000 note of that,
all right.
feeling that we need that. That's, would be my motion. Do you think, Carolyn?
Well, I'll second it, and then you just need to put it in. And so when we go back to the total budget, if they feel like that they want to review before we package the budget or review it omnibus, we can do that. But now is the time to put it in, and then the Ways and Means Committee will adjust everything.
So we'll just make a recommendation for the $50,000 to go towards nuisance species was inserted into our report.
Yeah, as requested by the agency.
Victoria's got to do that. So, Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to go back to my question on the shrinkage and the FTE. If we found that there was some extra positions that were not filled, could we use that money for those FTE positions to pay for this $50,000?
Victoria?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It kind of gets back to an earlier question and that the agency addressed a different problem. So their salaries and wages are funded by fees, and so it brings back the problem, can you use hunting and fishing licenses for aquatic nuisance species that we kind of addressed earlier? So I won't say yes or no, but it's something to think about. They may not be allowed to use fees that they use for salaries and wages for aquatic nuisance species.
Appreciate that information. However, if they would check that, make sure they couldn't do that. If they can do that for some reason or found a loophole to do that, all the other agencies are taking a 5% cut in shrinkage. And I believe that we probably have that also in our budget here. So if that's one thing to look at.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a motion and a second to proceed with the $50,000 pending moving it from the report and related to the fees. So any other discussion? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like Senator Alley's idea. However, I want to throw in another that I don't have an answer to. If it is an issue with the State Water Plan Fund, are there funds in EDIF, which is the lottery money, that could, because this agency is already getting EDIF money. If we, as a committee, made a recommendation that if the agency can use some money from open positions to use it for this $50,000, if not, it would be from EDIF or whatever the committee wants to decide. But my point is, I just thought I would ask if there might be money in EDIF for this $50,000 expenditure, because it's apparent that the committee thinks it's important to come up with the funds from somewhere.
Senator McGinn?
We certainly use EDIF money for these types of programs as well. And so generally what happens is the Senate makes a recommendation to put it in their budget if it crosses the floor and passes, and then, we go to the negotiation with the House. Once that's done, then the budget chairs of those two committees have to reconcile either coming out of State Water Plan or EDIF. So I think we're getting into a rabbit hole when this is all going to get reconciled later, because once you go through the negotiation with the House, you're either going to be above or you're going to be below. And then it gets settled within the water plan money and the EDIF.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I understand that. My thing is, if this committee is going to make a recommendation, that we just make a recommendation where it comes from. But it's not something I'm going to go to the mat on, but it just seems like to me it's easier if we give instructions to Ways and Means where we suggest the funds come from, as a budget subcommittee, if you will.
So you're saying that recommend that we decide where the money comes from at the Ways and Means level when we report it?
Well, the Ways and Means can always totally ignore our recommendation, but they generally don't, from at least on that other side of the Capitol. The appropriations would listen to budget committees. And so, again, it's not, to me, a big deal. It's just throwing out possible options, because Senator McGinn's right. Ultimately, in the conference committee, they will decide where this all comes from, but I kind of like to make a recommendation.
All right. Senator McGinn.
And before I did EDIF, I would like to see the EDIF chart, and I do not have that in front of me right now, so.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is this year, in this budget, there are no EDIF funds recommended currently. Is that the case? It's for Victoria.
No, Wildlife and Parks does receive EDIF funds currently. So some of it goes to tourism, which won't be in 22 because tourism is potentially moving to commerce, but they do receive EDIF for other things. So I'd have to look up the exact amount, but they do receive EDIF.
Thank you.
Senator Fagg.
Another quick comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Water quality, this is not only wildlife and rec, this is water quality thing here. So that's why this is so important too. So as mayor of El Dorado, we used to worry about that all the time in the lake coming into our water system. So I'm just saying this is an important thing to work on as we can.
All right, thank you. Committee, let's vote on what we're going to do with the $50,000 for nuisance species and where the money comes from. Will all be handled down the road here. So all in favor of the motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. Committee, I think that's all we have for wildlife. I do have the water office people here, which they've come now the third time. And basically, the governor's recommendation seems reasonable. And we have a list of enhancements that are being paid for by the state water plant. But do you have those, Kara?
Mr. Chairman, don't we need to pass the total budget for wildlife and parks? I mean, we made an amendment.
Oh, okay.
Don't we need to say with the amendment, we recommend it to go to?
If we're finished, yes, yeah.
Are we finished?
We're finished, wildlife and parks.
Well, I'd make a motion to take the governor's recs with the addition of the $50,000 in it for the, not endangered species, aquatic species, and move it forward to the Ways and Means Committee.
Okay, is there a second? Second. Moved in second. Do we move it towards Ways and Means Committee? Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. We'll go to the report in next week with that intact. Let's see, any questions on the State Water Plan Fund and the Water Office? We do have, we have the governor's recommendation that the water plan is under to deal with the RBUC and some of those things that I've heard were of interest that are not in there now. So, Carol, you want to come forward, just brief us a little bit on that, and then. Welcome to the committee, Carol. And by the way, she's the new appointee. I mean, she's not at the Water Office, so we welcome her.
Thank you. Yes, Assistant
Director.
of the Water Office. Thank you very much. So the list of, yes, Senator Kirshen, we, with our budget for FY 2022, had included enhancement requests that were made on behalf of the Water Authority, who recommended enhancements to the State Water Plan Fund for various initiatives and projects. And so we listed those enhancements, and a portion of those enhancements were put in our budget, recommended for 2022. And the list of those are actually on the second page of your testimony that was provided previously. So it was a total of $660,000 that was basically the portion of the enhancements that were requested by our office under the State Water Plan Fund. 200,000 of that was an assessment and evaluation, which was to advance implementation of items that were discussed during last year's, well, actually it was 2019 Special Committee on Natural Resources, including the Hayesville dewatering project, basin by basin flood evaluation studies, and other flood-related work. So that's the enhancement to the assessment and evaluation fund. There was also an increase of $100,000 in the water technology farms funding, which is to support enhancement and continued development of that program. And then $360,000 in watershed conservation practice implementation funding, which is funding that's provided as cost share to producers to implement conservation practices that reduce sediment runoff entering downstream reservoirs. So those were the programs that received that additional recommendation in FY 2022.
Thank you, Kara. I had 500,000 for watershed conservation. Is that?
Yes, so that was the base amount, and then beyond that base amount, that 660 is what made up the portion of the enhancement that was recommended in 22.
So what about that 150,000 for the Arbuckle? Is that included in there?
That is not included in the enhancements.
Okay. All right, Senator McGinn.
I hate to run the end of your meeting, but I have about 5 different items that I'm going to move around. And I don't think we can get it done in the last minute.
We've got tomorrow, and we have Victoria won't be here to do the budget stuff because we're having for the Dana Bueller we're going to confirm her tomorrow or make her appointment. We're going to hear that testimony tomorrow.
Do you think she would take the whole time? I was wondering, I mean, if we could just do it right off the bat tomorrow. Is that all we have tomorrow, is her appointment? What day is recommendation?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, we can flex our schedule a little bit here. Victoria won't be here, but she just can't do stuff if we have questions on the budget. But we can get the confirmation part of it away, and then we'll have time to discuss it after that. So
I'm moving it all around within the water money, so I'm not going into other areas, so just to let you know.
okay.
Just moving around the enhancements.
All right. Okay. We'll find out tomorrow. Committee, that wraps it up for today. I think we're going to, like I say, we'll have the hearing tomorrow for the Dana Bueller to the Water Office, and then we'll take up the Water Committee deliberation. We'll conclude that tomorrow then. Try to do that. Thank you for being patient and coming when we need you, Kara. With that, we are adjourned.